This landed at a ranch at Corona, New Mexico. The rancher turned it over to the Air Force. Rancher W.W. Brazil was the man who discovered the saucer.
What I thought was a star began coming in my direction at a very rapid rate of speed.
The unidentified object, which some sources thought might be a blimp, moved slowly down the Pacific coast from Santa Monica and disappeared south of Long Beach.
I saw a UFO, and it went down the river, turned right at the United Nations, turned left, and then down the river.
UFO Classified. UFO Classified. No more plausible deniability. Fact, fiction, or the truth. You decide. And now, the new voice of the high desert, the hostess of UFO Classified, Erica Lukes.
Making your mark on the world is hard. If it were easy, everybody would do it, but it's not. It takes patience, it takes commitment, and it comes with plenty of failure along the way. The real test is not whether you avoid this failure, because you won't. It's whether you let it harden or shame you into inaction, or whether you learn from it, whether you choose to persevere. Those are the words from former President Barack Obama that really exemplify my guest and his life, his commitment to preserving the truth, the history. My guest tonight is Barry Greenwood, and he is one of the most important people in this field. And if you want to know anything about history, he is the man that has lived it and has so much to share with us. I am thrilled to have him here. I want to tell you a little bit about him. Actually, it's a lot about him because he's accomplished so much. He is a UFO historian and archivist. He has been in this game since 1964. He served as an investigator and state section director for Massachusetts MUFON for 10 years. And in the late 70s, Barry started researching and doing FOIA requests with his colleagues. And because of that, he ended up co-authoring one of the most important books in ufology. It is called Clear Intent. That book came out in 1984, and he co-wrote that with Larry Fawcett. He was editor of the newsletter Just Cause for Citizens Against UFO Secrecy from 84 to 98. He had work in Flying Saucer Review, the MUFON Journal, international publications, and he has been specializing in UFO history. It is incredible. He has archives that you would not believe, and he also reaches out and finds archives that are in fear of getting tossed in the trash. People who either get tired of this field or don't know what to do with all of their work end up just letting it go to waste. And he and Jan Aldrich and some of his close colleagues have recovered all of these things and preserved them so each one of us can learn and move this work forward. He is just a gem. And Barry, I can't even tell you how happy I am to have you here. This is such a thrill for everyone. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad to be on. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, you're a legend. And when I think about Clear
in my own mind.
No, in all of our minds too. I mean, it's just every time I talk to you, you have more information, oh my gosh, the life you have lived.
Well, that's
64.
Because you're capable of bringing out memories that I've buried in the distant past.
Well, I'm glad, because those memories help me learn. And I think it's so important for everyone, especially all the new people getting into this field, to realize the gravity of the work that all of you have done, and the fact that you've done this tirelessly for decades.
Yes, back to 1964. I mean, I was only 11 years old then, but that doesn't mean you can't get off to a good start on a subject. And fortunately, the timing was there for the UFO topic to just come into prominence around that time. I had a natural interest in the space age and rockets and the astronauts and all, and UFOs didn't really come into it until about 64 when I heard about the Socorro, New Mexico incident involving a police officer seeing an object on the ground with apparent occupants. And I thought, wow, that's really strange. And it was only the beginning of a great upswing in the subject through the mid-60s. And because of that upswing, it kept my attention and motivated me to want to move along to continue researching the subject and see what it was all about. I had no preconceived conclusions about it. It just fascinated me, and I kept an eye on it all these years.
And we're really happy that you did, because you have one of the most important archives in the world.
That was a lot of time spent in libraries and university archives and hundreds and hundreds of letters in the mail and getting to know people in the subject who were some of the pioneers in the early days. And it was always my intent to try to get the subject under one umbrella, or at least an umbrella that was accessible to a lot of other people, so that you could find things. I had a very difficult time finding information back then. It was pre-internet, and you had to go the hard way. You had to pay visits to other cities and towns, go through microfilm, go through paper records, get your hands filthy, thumbing through old newspapers that were literally falling apart in your hands. And it just, all that effort led up to now, which is I'm buried in paper.
You know, I will definitely agree with that, because I talk to you via Skype and I see what you have in your home, and you are so meticulous about the way you catalog everything.
It has to be cataloged. If I didn't, I wouldn't know where to find things. There's just so much to it, thousands and thousands of bits of information that you like to have available. And if you don't have some sort of an inventory or index to it, then you're going to be thumbing through things for hours on end before you find them. I knew other researchers in the past that they didn't have a system, and I'd ask them about certain bits of information that they were involved with, and the inevitable reply from some of them was, well, I'll get around to it someday. They can't find it. And occasionally they sent me pictures where they lived, and I could understand why they couldn't find things. They had stacks of paper on sofas and chairs and in their pantries and in their barns and outhouses, wherever they could store anything.
Oh. Well, the outhouses doesn't sound like a very good plan, but, I'm just saying.
Well, it was a storage place for some people I know.
Really?
They weren't being used anymore as outhouses. They turned into storage sheds instead.
That's good. That's comforting.
But they were there.
So you were 11 when you got, into this. I know Fran Ridge I think he was about 13. So you both became interested in this at such a young age. But who were the first people that you turned to for information?
It was quite a while before I turned to any particular people. I just had a lot of reading to catch up on. I obtained some of the books that were circulating in the early years, and in the mid-'60s, when that big flurry of activity broke out with UFO reports, new books were produced. A small minority of them were really any good. Many of them were based on really bad information. They were what I call paperback pot boilers. They crank these things out within weeks of some UFO activity somewhere, where they were trying to cash in on the newness of the subject, and the write-ups were not very good. They were slipshod, full of errors, and I had to learn that the hard way by just constantly reading and rereading, and eventually I set up some mail contacts with individuals. One of the early ones I knew was Lucius Farish, who had been in the subject, I believe, from the late 50s on, and Lou was wonderful. He was able to help me sort out what was good information and what wasn't. And through him, I had contacted others who were fairly prominent in the subject. I never did speak to or contact Donald Kehoe, who was one of the early people who impressed me on the subject. He had written several books about government cover-up and secrecy and all, and that probably was the seed of my interest in government documents, but I really couldn't do anything about it in the 60s. There weren't many means to go about collecting government paperwork unless you were able to visit Project Blue Book in Dayton, Ohio, and actually see their files. They sent out press releases, occasional bits of information to the public, but certainly didn't reflect the entire holding that they had. And it was with the advent of the Freedom of Information Act, initially in 1966, but there was an amendment of it in 1974, and that made it much easier for people, average citizens, to query the government on what information they had in government records and files. And having the UFO interest already, I said, gee, I wonder if I could use that to extract government documents and paperwork. So I read the act. I went to the library, read it right out of the U.S. Code, saw how it worked, and I filed some requests. One of the early requests was, oddly enough, on the 1975 overflights, about 2 years, I think, after it happened, and it was based upon an article in the National Enquirer. People would laugh at that normally and say, oh, why are you using the Enquirer as a source of information? It was a tabloid newspaper. It carried a lot of fake stories, semi-fake stories, and some valid ones, but overall It had a terrible reputation. Well, they had a list of incidents that occurred along the northern border of the U.S. with Canada. And the incidents looked familiar because I had subscribed to a clipping service in 1974, so I had regular information coming in from newspapers where normally I wouldn't see as many press accounts. And weekly they'd send me these things, and I was having indications that some of the places listed in the Enquirer article were turning up in my press coverage. So I said, well, I must be getting some valid information about these stories. So I prepared a FOIA request, sent it into the Department of Air Force headquarters, and a while later, I received an envelope, and it was a release to me of what they call DDO talkers, which was raw intelligence, raw information about rapidly evolving situations. And incidents at Loring Air Force Base, Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, a few other places were listed in these talkers. And there seemed to have been some concern about releasing them to me originally because I had later located some correspondence from within the Air Force debating whether or not these should be released to me because some of them were highly classified as raw intelligence. And eventually they relented and all because I rather suspect that they knew I had specific information about these stories and that if they said they didn't occur or they didn't exist in the record, I could pull something out and say, well, look, here it is. So they decided that discretion was the better part, and they released them to me. And that began an avalanche of government paperwork for me. I used them to file other requests at each of the bases and then with other agencies. At the same time, other ufologists were filing their own requests. Todd Zeckel, Bruce Maccabee, Brad Sparks, a number of other people. And they were getting different results. It seemed like, depending on where you filed requests, you would sometimes get different answers to the same questions.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that motivated us to keep going. But I was concerned, I think the others were as well, that this had begun in earnest around 1976, 77, and there was a looming presidential election coming up where we were very concerned that if Ronald Reagan had won the presidency, it might mean either the end or an extreme watering down of the Freedom of Information Act, because Republicans at the time were very security conscious and they didn't want a lot of internal government paperwork circulating. So we moved quickly with requests. Robert Todd is another one. He was one of the greatest FOIA requesters I ever ran across. He'd crank out dozens a day sometimes to different places, and he was getting a lot of positive results as well. But we had to move, and when 1980 rolled around and Reagan was elected, there was an effort to reduce the effectiveness of FOIA, as we called it. And we saw a general slackening off of responses at the times originally given for responses by agencies were usually within about 10 days of when you sent a letter, and they'd have to get right back to you and tell you what they were going to do. But as the 80s rolled around, the times were getting longer. They were getting to be weeks, months, and nowadays it can take years to fulfill a FOIA request. So up until 1984, we had gathered, I think, about 4,000 pages of records from mainly the CIA and FBI. Those are the bulk of the documents that we were able to get out, but we had others too. We were involved in some highly publicized court cases at the time, once against the CIA and the other one against the National Security Agency. The CIA suit resulted in this bulk of the CIA paperwork that we were able to receive back then. The NSA received a small, they released a small number of documents, but the documents were rather compelling and interesting, especially one. And we were people trying to determine whether there was a cover-up on UFOs. This one document was used in the court case against the NSA, and it was an affidavit as to the government's reasons for withholding NSA UFO records. And the thing was 80% censored. And I looked at it and I said, I can't imagine something that was more explicitly illustrating the fact that UFO information was being covered up at the time by just flashing this document, which in some cases, whole pages were nothing but magic marker, and there wasn't a single letter available.
Wow.
So that was the beginning of government documents accumulation. Now, the Air Force in 1975 had sent their Project Blue Book files to Maxwell Air Force Base, and they were accessible there. And then eventually they ended up in the National Archives for anyone to go and look at. And they made microfilm copies, so I was able to, rather than spending weeks on end far away from home, I was able to order up a set of microfilms. There were well over 100 rolls, and it contained the entire Air Force's record of UFO investigations. So I used those. I used the government paperwork that we received from FOIA, and that all led to finally deciding to do a book called Clear Intent.
Which is a book that everyone should own. And I will tell you, it's an out of print book. And so you need to go on Amazon and grab a copy because. Yeah,
it's out of print right now, but.
Are you going to?
It can still be had on the secondary market.
Well, maybe you need to think about getting that back up and going for all of us. I mean, you could, we'll talk off the air, but I mean, this is such an important book. And I've had, James Clarkson, who's the Washington State Director for the Mutual UFO Network. I mean, he has said this is what got him into this field, was your book.
Yeah, I've had several folks contact me about that and saying that, boy, that's what really led to them getting deeply involved in the subject. I can't see how a rational-minded person could avoid not being fascinated by some of that data that was released. It was utter contradiction to previous statements that government agencies had made about UFOs, saying there was nothing to it, nothing to be gained, no scientific interest in proceeding with it. And when you look at the paperwork, you see they're fascinated with it. They don't know how to explain many incidents. Incidents were of a national security nature, completely opposite of the public stance by the Air Force, for example. So, you see one thing. What do you believe? Government's statements or your own eyes? Your eyes are telling you there's more to this than what they're telling you.
Absolutely, and it's so easy. I mean, we can see why this subject has been buried, because it took you a lot of work and your colleagues a lot of work, a lot of money, a lot of effort, and learning how to know specifically what to request when you were requesting it, because they were so good at, kind of pushing information away if you didn't ask specifically for certain things.
Well, Robert Todd had dealt a lot with NORAD. He was a UFO investigator from Ardmore, Pennsylvania. He's unfortunately no longer with us, but he focused on NORAD and their activities, because what more likely place would you expect to find hard evidence of UFO activity than with the agency that can detect solid objects within the atmosphere going in and out of outer space. And NORAD monitored our skies regularly, trying to determine what's up there, and if there's anything unusual, react to it. So we had the notion that NORAD must have had a list of unknown reports, unknown objects being detected. And they did admit at one point that they had something like 10 million uncorrelated observations. We thought that was interesting, but it's an awful lot of data to go through. But the potential was, I think, and I spoke about this with some of the others back then, that let's suppose you have a UFO sighting near the ground, group of people report it, hopefully independent observers see the same thing hovering 100-200 feet above the ground. Now, often when people report these things, the sighting ends with the whatever it is they're looking at shooting up into the air and disappearing. Mm-hmm. Well, what if one of these objects shot up into the air and went out into space and NORAD picked it up at that same location? If we could determine whether any NORAD uncorrelated observations correlated with ground UFO sightings, that would be fabulous.
Oh, that would be fabulous. And we've got to take a break really quick, but when we get back, we're going to talk more about this, about Robert Todd. I want to just mention Paul Dean, who is amazing, and we'll talk about him as well. I am here. This is Erica Lukes with UFO Classified with a very special guest, Barry Greenwood. We are going to take a break, and we will be right back.
Stand by. This is UFO Classified with Erica Lukes. Erica Lukes. The phone lines are open now at 702-425-9230. That's 702-425-9230. Worldwide callers use Skype name KCOR Radio. More UFO Classified. UFO Classified with Erica Lukes on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. After this. Within the ethers of reality, there sits a bridge, a hot spot between what we see and what we don't see.
Testing, can you hear me?
Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, join Becky Vickers on Bridging the Paranormal as she interviews paranormal investigators from around the world and explores how the shadows of the past meet the present.
Let's begin.
Bridging the Paranormal will take you to some of the most haunted places in the world in search of proof that the dead still walk among us.
I see dead people.
Becky Vickers' Southern charm will have you believing in the unbelievable.
I myself am strange and unusual.
Live Tuesday nights at 5 p.m. Pacific at 8 p.m. Eastern, Bridging the Paranormal. Bridging the Paranormal. Hosted by Becky Vickers. Paranormal talk about the dark side, but with a lighter side touch. Exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. It's time to believe. Believe
in the unbelievable.
Monday nights are about to become hauntingly good, as Reverend Sean Whittington possesses the airwaves with Vegas Supernatural. Tune in every Monday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern for Vegas Supernatural, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. There's a war raging between good and evil. The question is, which side are you fighting on? Tune in Monday nights as Reverend Sean Whittington sets the new standard for paranormal radio with some of the most influential personalities in the world today. Vegas Supernatural, hosted by Reverend Sean Whittington, every Monday night at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. The one show even the devil doesn't want you to hear.
Broadcasting in digital HD radio.
What if maintaining a healthy weight was as simple as drinking a cup of coffee? With Valentis coffee, it's that easy. Harvested from the world's most pristine coffee farms and packed with the purest ingredients on earth, Valentis takes losing weight to a completely new level. At Valentis, we believe everyone deserves a chance to be healthy and fit. It's pure, natural, healthy, and delicious. Click the Valentis Healthiest Coffee banner on the KCOR Digital Radio Network website and take the Weight Loss Guarantee Challenge. Valentis Coffee, simply the world's healthiest coffee.
Each week, join Patrick Phillips as he takes you inside Hollywood. In-depth celebrity interviews, the very latest entertainment news, and more. Patrick Phillips hosts Pop Culture Tonight.
Join me Thursdays at 1 p.m. right here on the KCOR Digital Radio Network.
You're listening to UFO Classified with Erica Lukes, where the truth isn't hidden beneath the black lines of a Sharpie.
That's the craziest thing I've ever heard.
To be on with Erica, call 702-425-9230. That's 702-425-9230. Worldwide callers use Skype name KCOR Radio.
Radio contact.
Share your thoughts on the show on Twitter by using hashtag KCOR. Or head over to the live chats at KCORradio.com.
The audience goes nuts!
And now, your host of UFO Classified.
Are you ready?
Erica Lukes.
Happy Fantopia Friday, my friends. I'd like to just thank all of you for getting in the chat room. I know that Fringe Radio is their UFO author, my research partner, Jeff Cox, and Libertas, all of you. I can't thank you enough, and thank you for listening. I am still getting messages every week from people all over the world who are listening and want good information, and it is my goal to bring you people that will open your eyes and teach you things as we all learn about this fascinating subject, an important subject together. My guest this evening is one of the world's foremost historians and archivists with regard to UFOs. And if he has lived the history, it is amazing. He co-authored a book, Clear Intent, that you can find. And I know my friends in the chat room are feverishly trying to find it. Please get it. It is so amazing. And he also worked with Michael Swords, Robert Powell, and a few others on UFOs and government, a historical inquiry, another important book that you need to add to your library. When we left off, we were talking about Robert Todd, NORAD, all of these important things. And so, Barry, let's pick up where we left off.
Yeah, well, just to encapsulate the last story about NORAD, we wanted to see if there was any data from NORAD agreeing with the possibility that objects could go from near the ground into space, and you'd have ground witnesses being confirmed by NORAD radar tracking. So we put that request in. We realized that the amount of data was prodigious, but the answer we got back from NORAD was that they'd be glad to supply that information, but under FOIA regulations, they'd have to charge search and reproduction fees. And I think in that particular case, it cost well over $100,000. So obviously we couldn't comply with something like that. We had to let the request go. And with that, any dream of getting such confirmation. So we moved along to other matters, and eventually NORAD, which had once been subject to FOIA, was turned into an international agency because of our cooperation with Canada on the radar network. So it was no longer a place you could submit FOIA requests to. And that was that. They'll still receive questions and queries, and you can send a FOIA, but they're just not going to reply in any great detail to matters involving UFOs. Yeah,
because obviously they're sitting on a gold mine of information. So
yeah, a potential gold mine. I mean, there's no guarantee that information is there, but it is a much increased possibility that you could make such confirmations, given the amount of UFO reports that exist and the amount of uncorrelated targets that have been picked up over the years. And yeah, most of those targets are nuts and bolts, small scraps, certainly not mysterious in any way, but if there are mysterious ones there, that we're just not going to find out about them unless they leak out.
Well, if anybody can help with that, it's Paul Dean.
Yeah, Paul is.
With you. Oh, he is relentless. I love that, and I love that you two work together. And Paul
is a later generational example of Robert Todd. Todd was just incredible at constantly hammering at government agencies to release things under FOIA relating to UFOs. And Todd's gone now, and we needed someone to pick up the slack, and then suddenly Paul Dean appears.
You know, I think that you're right. If anybody can take over where he left off, it's Paul. He's relentless, and I love that. It's amazing, and he's so much knowledge. I mean, it just spews out of him when he talks. I love it. But let's talk about Robert Todd, because Robert Todd is somebody that a lot of the younger people getting into this don't know much about him, and you knew him and worked with him quite well. So can you tell us about him?
Yeah, well, I heard of Bob through some of the early publications where he had filed FOIA requests in the 76, 77 era, and his results would be printed in some of the newsletters at the time, particularly one called the Just Cause. And it was an early version of the Just Cause that I had done. It existed between, I think, 1970, probably late 76 through 1980. And I saw Todd's name in there, and I was fascinated because he seemed to be getting some very interesting releases from the government. I contacted him and told him I was doing the same thing. So we compared notes on what each other had, and I stayed in touch with him through the years, talking on the phone at night, late nights. I had a night job, and after I'd come home, I'd be on the phone with him between 11 at night and about 2:30 in the morning, hashing over the latest results and what was going on in the subject. And he was extremely helpful in getting hard information about things that maybe some of the other researchers hadn't had time to do. I had a regular job, so I couldn't file FOIAs every day. Just a few hours at night, maybe I could knock things out. But Bob was able to crank these requests out continuously, and I'd send him information. He'd have his own information to follow up on, and he was able to acquire thousands of pages of records. And much of it wasn't necessarily in the form of actual government documents, but the answers he received from government agencies were very revealing sometimes. I think he was able to extract more about NORAD during those years than anyone was able to. He was sent copies of logs from different NORAD regions. People would call in sighting reports. They'd log them in on a sheet, and he'd request month by month by month of all of these information holdings from them, either things they generated themselves or whatever people called in. And we were able to piece together a pretty good picture of how NORAD operated with regard to UFOs. They actually had a UFO sighting report form. Most people don't know that, but NORAD had one. And a copy is included in Clear Intent in the appendix, but I don't recall seeing one of those actually filled out.
So where is that information now? All of his work.
Bob, periodically, he'd suffer what I think a lot of us had done over the years, and that's burnout, where he'd spend so much time on the subject that suddenly he would just grow frustrated sometimes with answers he was being given that were evasive, and just fatigue from filing all the requests. He'd pack up his files and then send them out to someone, usually someone he was in contact with. The first time he did that, he had sent groups of files to myself. Ray Fowler is another UFO investigator, locally to me, and the Center for UFO Studies. And then his huff would reduce, and he'd get back into it, and for years work on more reports, more information, more documents, more requests. And then again, he'd pretty much unload his material again.
Oh my gosh.
He worked in long starts and short fits, where he would clear out his house. Yeah, in a way, he had to sometimes. He told me once that his house was so packed with government files that the ceiling on the first floor was cracked, and his house was in danger of collapse from all the paperwork, so he had to do that. And then, when he grew ill a number of years ago, and he realized that he wasn't able to recover from it, so he had Jan Aldrich go down and pack up his files and take them away. And since then, Jan and I had been going over the materials and trying to make head or tails of what he was doing, which was fabulous. But Bob passed several years ago. He was about my age. So I really miss him. But now Paul Dean comes out of Australia, and I find that he has the same motivations, the same mentality, the same drive that Bob Todd did. So I saw that, and I encouraged him to keep it up, keep going with this. I was on the phone, on Skype with him a lot, and trying to help him out by passing along copies of government records that we had acquired previously to show him how it worked then, and maybe how to apply it to what was being collected by government now with regards to UFO reports. And he's been putting it to practical use, not only in Australia, but here, by filing requests with government agencies. You can still use FOIA even if you live in another country.
Isn't that wonderful? And he really has, he is, I really feel that people in the States need to know about him. And I always am telling everyone I know, because we need to encourage this younger generation, and there are people out there like Paul and Dave Marler and other people in this field that really have the drive, and they understand the commitment it takes. And that's the important thing. I think people kind of get into this and they think, well, I'm just going to be an investigator and have a barbecue every other Saturday and invite my friends over, and that's the end of the work. But this takes, going and researching, looking at newspaper archives, taking your money and making FOIA requests. I mean, this is a financial commitment as well.
Yeah, it may seem odd to people interested in the subject now with all of the sources available, the internet and all of the past resources that have been pulled together by other researchers. But I consider the subject still in grave danger. because much of the information is not in institutional hands, save for the government agencies that collect files and all. They periodically purge their files so that some things do disappear that you were able to see at one time. So that was one purpose in using the FOIA, that we wanted to make sure those things were lost. But in general, the subject itself, the researchers who began in the 50s and 60s, they moved along, passed away, and so on, and their records are there, and something has to be done with them. They would, if they were lucky, were able to pass things to other equally as interested researchers so that the records would pass on. But in other cases, I could tell you some terrible horror stories about people's collections, their case investigations, their monographs, and unpublished manuscripts, things that were absolutely tossed into the trash, literally put out on the sidewalk for the garbage truck to pick up. And those records are gone. There's no retrieving them unless someone has photocopies of some of it. We do have some, but it's just way too much that's vanished. And that danger still exists.
Oh, absolutely.
Given that the subject now, I mean, it has a presence on the net, but where it used to be very popular was in the regular media, television, old radio, newspapers, and they've all changed. Newspapers are vanishing. They're going online, so you don't have that source. Newspapers tended to edit the information they published, whereas a lot of what's published now as news is no longer edited. You hear about it being discussed now as fake news, where bad information gets out there and it's treated on an equal basis with factual information.
Right.
That's not good. And it's especially not good with UFO data because it's very hard to ascertain its factual nature to begin with, because it's a transient phenomenon. It's here 1 minute and it's gone the next. And if you're lucky, you can either record it on film or get some kind of a trace, but they're never enough to prove anything with regard to origin, what they are, who's in them, where they come from. It's just a matter of, well, we have this very interesting data and we don't know where we can take it beyond a certain point.
And that's true. I mean, it's become so convoluted. And I think that, unfortunately, like you were saying when we were on break, I mean, the glory days, the golden days of this were really back in the 60s when you had so many people of high caliber that were looking into this. And now we've got, this is such a cottage industry that has become all about selling memberships or books or, whatever, that we have kind of pushed aside the real research, and that is a shame, and it's really devalued what you and all of your colleagues have worked so hard for.
Oh, I remember a time when the subject was headline news. It would be on the nightly news. First story, someone's photograph came out, or some strange report came through channels. There were two congressional investigations during the 60s. The Air Force was actively investigating the subject and sightings that came in. It's arguable over the quality of some of that investigation, but they was doing it nevertheless. And the subject had an aura of credibility at that time that I think is faded now, where you might have better reports, better information with those reports. I think of a story like Stephenville, Texas, in 2008, where that's a quality UFO report. That's something that should be discussed, made available to people, and to ponder over as to the nature of what was seen. And there's not enough of that anymore.
So, I mean, with my time in MUFON, I mean, I feel that we weren't given the tools to properly succeed as investigators. And I know it's a volunteer organization, but what failings do you see that some of the large organizations have had with regard to really getting good caliber, good quality information and training people to move and look in the right direction.
Well, the organizations at one time, and to a certain extent, MUFON still has, they published a field investigator's manual at one time, and it's been updated and brought into current times and all. It's a very good document. It teaches people how to be discriminating about mundane, ordinary things as opposed to what's really odd about a story. And they teach the investigators to at least try to be scientific. The problem is that organizations, despite their honest intentions at first, eventually trail off into a matter of belief where they're pushing an agenda for the subject rather than just trying to be carefully objective and presenting information without a tinge of what they think it might be. The organizations thrive. I think most of the membership wants to be told what the subject is. What are these objects? What are they all about? And with the lack of hard evidence as to an origin and a purpose by all of this, you're going to lose your audience over time. 10 years, 20 years go by, and you're still debating over whether UFOs are real.
Right.
Well, I mean, UFOs are real. There are unidentified objects. Some of them fly, and they seem to be, some of them at least, solid, depending on data you get from radar and close encounters of the second kind, where you find flattened areas and fields and all. Who knows what that is? I don't know. It's a mystery. That's what it's all about. We knew what it was, we'd be saying it's the Martian flying objects or the Venusian flying objects. We don't know what it is, so it's unidentified. That's the way it should stay until you get something that absolutely tells you what the answer is. That hasn't happened yet. Even though the sightings are fascinating, they're incredible puzzles. There are many of them out there, but you can't regard any one thing as proof.
Right.
And that's the difficulty the organizations have. They have to keep people interested in doing that, short of finding an ultimate answer. You just keep building an incredible pile of unknown, unexplained incidents. And some folks get tired and they just want to do something else. They feel, well, I'm not getting to the answer, so, they have something else to do. And right. The organizations need funding, too. Money is another problem.
Do you think that sometimes we've talked about this before, but I think it's a lot of what we've seen is kind of ineffective leadership. That too.
You can have leaders that, and we had this problem in the past with some organizations that you want to be scientific about it. That's the best way to go, to judge information without bias. But often the leadership of organizations, to maintain their membership, find it necessary to be biased to keep the membership involved. Scientific sounds good, but I'll be damned, it bores an awful lot of people. They don't want to wait for that. They want answers right away or fairly soon, or the promise of answers quickly. And the subject doesn't cooperate that way.
No.
It just keeps presenting puzzle after puzzle after puzzle to you and not revealing very much behind that black curtain of insufficient information that you need to have from these stories to resolve them. But there always seems to be something missing from reports where you just don't have enough to be able to nail it down once and for all. And there's stories that come pretty close. Some very interesting reports that they have a lot of data with them that suggest a very unusual, exotic nature.
Exactly. And I think that's the whole key is we have enough data. And I've always said that what we need to do with the data is actually analyze it or be transparent with it. And with that data, we can see that there are specific places all over the world that have recurrent sightings. It's like Brown Mountain, that huge file you sent me. How far back does that file go?
Well, I think the sightings began around 1913, and if you pull in Indian legends and settler observations from diaries and all, it might go back further than that. People have always seemed to see lights there that were really strange.
And that is, it's quite interesting, the ghost lights, or, whatever we're calling them. And it's interesting. These are always kind of dismissed by current researchers or investigators as just, oh, those lights in the sky, when actually maybe some of them could be explained, but maybe there could be something more to these objects because we're seeing them in specific places decade after decade.
Right. There was an incident in 1957, which it always fascinated me. It's one of the top stories, in my opinion, as to strangeness, and that was at Levelland, Texas, where in early November that year, a big wave of flying saucer reports had broken out, probably some of it in response to news about the second Sputnik going up by the Russians. At the time, people were watching the skies. There was a moon watch program that had been run by Alan Hynek, who later became quite famous for UFO reports. In '57, he was in charge of encouraging people to sky watch and look for satellites and how they behaved and where they were and how many were up there and all. And this UFO activity broke out in Levelland, and it involved like more than a half a dozen people reporting seeing these weird egg-shaped objects popping up all around the city. And in almost every case, the objects seemed to interfere with the vehicles these people were in.
Oh, isn't that interesting? We've got to go to break, but we're going to talk about that when we get back because this is really incredible. I'm Erica Lukes. I'm here with Barry Greenwood. We will be back on the other side of the break, so stick around.
Listen very carefully.
This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
This is UFO Classified, live every Friday night, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. The truth is out there, just waiting to be discovered.
And now, if you will, accompany me on a journey to the future.
For more information on the host of UFO Classified, Erica Lukes, upcoming guests, as well as links to the past shows,
visit her website at UFOclassified.com.
UFO Classified.
UFO Classified.
This is KCOR Las Vegas, home of the Digital Radio Network, broadcasting from a shack just south of Area 51.
Wait, that doesn't exist.
This is the KCOR Digital Radio Network. Now for the news.
Now, broadcasting in digital HD radio.
The disc landed at a ranch at Corona, New Mexico. The rancher turned it over to the Air Force. Rancher W.W. Brazil was the man who discovered the saucer.
What I thought was a star began coming in my direction at a very rapid rate of speed.
The unidentified object, which some sources thought might be a blimp, moved slowly down the Pacific coast from Santa Monica and disappeared south of Long Beach.
I saw a UFO, and it went down the river, turned right at the United Nations, turned left, and then down the river.
UFO Classified.
UFO Classified.
No more plausible deniability. Fact, fiction, or the truth. You decide. And now, the new voice of the high desert, the hostess of UFO Classified, Erica Lukes.
Welcome back, everyone, for the second half of UFO Classified. I'm Erica Lukes here with a very special man who has done a tremendous job preserving history for decades for all of us to learn from and to pass on to future generations. I honestly don't think there is somebody that we need to really honor as much as we do. Our guest tonight, Barry Greenwood, is a historian and archivist. He has done tremendous work. His book, Clear Intent with Larry Fawcett, is available on Amazon if you're lucky enough to find a copy, so grab that now. And in the words of Barry Greenwood, he said, one could only rehash the same presentation that is chugged along for many decades before it becomes forgettable from eternal repetition. And I love that. I love that quote. And you can find that on greenwoodufoarchive.com, which is where Barry has a tremendous amount of work, archives there that you can learn from. Get in there and start doing your own research. That's what it's there for. So when we left off, we were talking about the 1957 story in Texas. So let's pick it up.
Right, Levelland, Texas, one of the more fascinating UFO reports you'll ever see. As I mentioned, half a dozen people see these weird egg-shaped objects flying around, and vehicles, ignition systems, and lights are being interfered with. The Air Force looks into it, and this is the same agency that later on, with the Condon report and all, had dismissed the reports as being of anything useful. Well, after the Air Force investigated Levelland, they wrote this conclusion, and I'm quoting from their record card, the conclusions at the front of the file. After very extensive checks and detailed investigations by the Air Force and with complete collaboration with both Air Force and non-governmental scientists, it was concluded that the sighting was due to a very rare phenomena, ball lightning. Now I look at that and I say, wait a minute, there wasn't supposed to be anything to these reports, and yet they're concluding here that there's something about the phenomenon, at least in this case, that is of great interest to science. Ball lightning's not well understood. It's definitely a topic of research. You don't see a whole lot of it going on in the United States. Oddly enough, the Russians have done a great deal more on ball lightning research than most anywhere else in the world. And they produced a lot of papers on the topic. But just the idea that Project Blue Book had concluded that there was a strange, rare phenomenon behind at least one of the sightings, just that one report would want to encourage me to keep looking into the reports, the stories that were coming down from the public, with the possibility that one of them might lead to a major discovery in science. And yet, the story's almost forgotten now. It's only part of UFO lore, and it turns up in some of these lurid TV documentaries, usually exaggerated beyond belief, and people get a wrong impression from such presentations like that. The reality is there's something to learn from some of the reports, and it's in print from the government itself. And that's what Clear Intent was all about.
And again, I hope everybody reads this. We'll have a discussion about this again. But I mean, with regard to Blue Book, what were some of the other important cases that you saw?
Oh, the Blue Book is a chronicle of UFO history from 1947 on. They don't have as much on 1947 as one might think. For example, Ted Blocher, a researcher back in the 50s and 60s, had written a monograph on the entire 1947 sighting wave. There were literally hundreds of reports that came out that year up to that time that became known to researchers. Now we know that there were many, many hundreds of reports, into the thousands, based upon just the newspaper coverage alone that we had recorded and searched. But Blue Book didn't have, at the time, an infrastructure for an organization. The subject was brand new, so they didn't really have a means to investigate all these things until later. And that's when the official investigations really kicked off. They looked into most important stories. Some seem to have slipped by them. But if you want details of some classic old sighting reports that you read about in books and magazines, go to Project Blue Book. There's a site called Fold 3 that reproduces the entire Blue Book file. At least as far as what specifically named case files existed. There seems to be a lot of information there that's hard to find because they're not well indexed. But most of the big cases are logged in, and you can look them up through a search engine and read the actual documents about these old sightings that are right from the horse's mouth.
And that's important. And I just have to throw this in there. Fold 3 is actually, owned by the Mormon Church.
Yeah.
And so it was interesting when they came in, and I know that John Greenwood had published the Blue Book files as well, and then there was some interesting goings-ons with that. But yeah, it is on there, and you can get links to that, and it is really important to read these old cases.
They're actual reproductions of the microfilm, so it's not like the information's been retyped and changed by someone. You can see the actual images of the files.
And I will tell you that the Blue Book cases that with regard to Utah, I mean, they have absolutely blown my mind. And thanks to you, I've got the Waldo Harris case and the audio tape that you sent me with the witness interviews. I'm just thrilled beyond belief. But some of these sightings, they really kind of parallel some of the current time sightings reports that we're getting now.
Right. You'll find too that a lot of what was reported in the 50s is very much like what was reported in the 80s, 90s, and even in modern times. Reports haven't changed a great deal at all. The interpretations of them have sometimes, but the reports themselves, the balls of light, the disc-shaped objects, sometimes triangular shapes, all kinds of shapes and sizes, they're consistently reported through the years by people. And in that sense, the subject is somewhat consistent.
And you and I have talked about the different terminology for things like the airship, the aeroplane, the fire balloon. Right. I mean, tell us a little bit about that, and with each kind of era, how the terminology changed.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you go back into times prior to the original Kenneth Arnold incident in 1947, you'll notice strange flying objects being reported by people. You'll see the same kind of headlines that you see now: ball of light seen streaking across the sky, a strange object hovering, doing all the same things you expect a UFO report to be. But they're before UFO reports became a distinct topic. And in 1945, such reports were within the military called Foo Fighters, Kraut fireballs, balls of fire, balls of light in the intelligence reports that came down from some of the bomber and mission pilots. You go before that time, you'll see sightings in the 30s, the 20s, the teens, mysterious aircraft, mysterious airplanes, mysterious blimps, mysterious zeppelins. 1909, my own area, New England, had a tremendous wave of reports in December of that year, which to New Englanders, December is a really odd time to have a UFO sighting flap because it's very cold and people don't go out. But there were stories about a mysterious inventor flying a very unusual aircraft, and people would go out and report this, especially about the week before Christmas. Practically every day there were headlines in the local news about so-and-so's flying machine doing routes up the North Shore and out to the middle of Massachusetts and back again. And those were never totally explained. I think a lot of them might have been based on sightings of Venus, which was prominent at the time, but other reports had the object moving across large swaths of the sky, which certainly couldn't have been Venus in a short amount of time. And before that, you had the 1890s, the airships. That's what people called airplanes before they had a word airplane. But there was still the same kind of strange, odd, peculiar objects that people were reporting in modern times. There was some, I think, a bit of embellishment at that time because Victorian era things were described often in flowery languages. So you would have objects being seen that had rudders, fins, rotors, cables, canopies, sails all over them, but otherwise they couldn't be identified as anything that was known to be flying around at the time. So yeah, there's a long evolution of the phenomenon in name and in appearance sometimes.
And we've talked about too about, within each country in different regions that the type of phenomenon is different.
Yeah.
And tell us about, was it Latin America?
Yeah, there was a curiosity. I had a chat with Bob Pratt one time, who wrote a book about South American UFO reports and how distinctive they were from what happened, north of the equator. Their abduction stories were fascinating in that while we had such reports being described as people being floated up out of beds, through walls, through windows, without breaking anything. In South America, the abductions consisted of flying saucers sending a hook out and literally picking people up by the hook as if they were fishing. And that was a consistent feature of their reports. And I was amazed by that, in that it seemed like in many ways, the phenomenon was being interpreted in some fine details by the culture with which it was involved. And how do you explain that? Is that embellishment by the culture, or is that really happening? Well, it's anyone's call, but the distinctions like that were amazing to me. It's almost like each culture was interpreting the phenomenon in a different way, with different physical features, but yet the same basic thing. They claimed people were being abducted and picked up. Well, did some of them have an escalator going up to the flying object? I don't know, but I mean, that seems to be the kind of characteristic that was being applied to those stories.
Oh, that's fascinating. Has anyone ever done an in-depth study about that?
There may have been. I'm not an abduction researcher myself. I'm more of a historian, but you could probably find someone that could comment on that.
Okay. I mean, because that is really curious. And then you see the abduction cases kind of waning off, tapering off. What is your take on that?
I don't know. At one time, there was an attempt to try to verify abduction reports. We had a professor at MIT locally here, Dave Pritchard, who put out a call for examples of implants, artifacts that people claim were being put into their bodies, up their noses, inserted into them in any manner of ways. And he wanted to be able to analyze these things and determine once and for all if any of these are extraterrestrial or of an advanced civilization that doesn't come from the Earth. And I think he received a handful of examples like that. And when he checked them, every one of them turned out to be mundane, of earthly origin, nothing to get excited about. And no more had come in, and he felt it was sort of a false flag phenomenon that people were saying these implants were genuine alien artifacts, but in fact, you just couldn't prove any of them to be anything exotic at all. And he lost interest at that point and moved along to other topics. But I thought it was an interesting attempt to do hardcore research. It didn't come out the way I think ufologists would like it to come out, but at least he showed enough attention to it that he tried to resolve it.
Right. And that's the key. We need to try to resolve this. And I also think we need to work together. But speaking of just some of these anomalous things, I want to go back to the Foo Fighters sightings, because that was truly exceptional. And the amount of work that Keith Chesters did.
Yes, Keith was amazing. He spent 10 years paying over 100 visits to the National Archives at his own motivation and at our prompting, too. Myself and Jan Aldrich tried to help him to locate information at the archives, because we had some experience there already. Back in 1992, I paid a visit to Archives 2, where kept a lot of old bombing and fighter mission reports for World War II, and they were kept in these big 2-foot-long boxes. And I had been through a group of them on this particular day. It was the last day of my doing research, and I figured I'd see if I can find anything about Foo Fighters at all. And I had this box, and it was just, I had to fly through it. And I tried to be meticulous about it, but there was just so many pages that I could just skim them basically over about a 6-hour period that I had before I had to leave. But in that time frame, I found 15 documents. Several of them specifically said Foo Fighters, and I think that was the first time any official paperwork on that phenomenon had surfaced. And I wrote it up, and I had found other things on microfilm back then, and then Keith read about it, and he asked us questions on where to look and how to find things, and he went about his business collecting. And last year, he said he was getting out of the World War II research on Foo Fighters, and would I take his material? I said, well, sure, yeah. I mean, send it along. He'd summarized it in his book, Strange Company, but it only scratched the surface. So he said, okay, I'll send them up. And in the mail came like 3 large boxes, and I looked at it, and I said, oh man, how am I going to get through this? It was as big as that 2-foot box I had mentioned at the archives before. Mm-hmm. But I realized at the same time I had to sort it out, because again, you have a mass like that, how do you find things? So I created an inventory, an Excel file that systematized all the data. I went through every page with dates and keywords and from and to and all of that. And I finally had an over 1,200 item list of documents, all exclusively devoted to Foo Fighters. And it's the biggest massive information on Foo Fighters that they've ever seen in one place. People had thought there were fragmentary mentions of it in old World War II reports. Well, it was more than fragmentary. There was some times during the war when it was frequently reported, especially in early 1945, late 44 in the European theater, 45 more so in the Pacific. But it was the same kind of thing being reported in both theaters of operation.
And it caused a lot of concern. I mean, people weren't sure, different countries weren't sure where this was coming from, and pilots were trying to engage this.
Either side thought it was the other's secret weapon. And these objects would come up from the ground, or they'd come from the distance, catch up with the aircraft, maneuver with the aircraft, hang behind, and then go over them, under them, off the wingtips, maneuver around with relative impunity. Often the gunners were able to get shots at them, and they said either when they shot them, either the objects exploded or that the bullets would go right through them with no effect at all, depending on the situation. But the objects were never specifically identified as any particular secret weapon. There were speculations about whether these were Nazi jets or some sort of exotic new rocket-type vehicles that had more advanced movements to them rather than just going up and blowing up near an aircraft. These objects behaved more intelligently, and they made observations to that effect in their reports, that these objects behave more like just dumb bombs. They would go and chase something, explode. These were maneuvering around, and sometimes they'd accompany the aircraft for half an hour at a time. The aircraft would try to get away, and the object would just maintain distance with them, and eventually move off, and no firing, no damage, nothing. It was just like a curiosity that these things hung about and would go away eventually. And that's what constituted the Foo Fighter phenomenon.
And, now you look at some of the reports that NARCAP has studied, and it's I believe it's the same type of thing.
Yeah, balls of light phenomena, sure. It's something that's constantly been reported through the years, but, they're not called Foo Fighters anymore. They're called balls of light.
or spheres or orbs. I mean, who knows what we're calling them?
Everybody, every time has their own designation for these things. Foo Fighters was a particularly appropriate World War II comment. It was named after a comic strip that was popular at the time.
What comic strip was that? Because I need to find this.
Smokey Stover.
Oh.
It was a comic fireman. He always used a phrase involving the word fou. And fou is the French word for fire. So it was a catchphrase. He'd inject it into certain comments in most of the strips. You'd see a little sign hanging up over a comic building where there's fou, there's fire, or some such remark. And it was very popular with the soldiers and all, and these guys with the fireballs said, hey, man, it looked like Smokey Stover's foo balls. So that's how they got the name.
That's incredible. And I mean, I really think that Keith Chester and, I mean, your contribution, this is really important to me. This is where I want to go, because I think this anomalous light phenomena is really kind of key to what we're seeing. But I'm Erica Lukes. I'm here with Barry Greenwood. That is the music, so we're going to take a break. You can go to greenwoodarchive.com to see more, and we will be right back.
Stand by. This is UFO Classified with Erica Lukes.
Erica Lukes.
The phone lines are open now at 702-425-9230. That's 702-425-9230. Worldwide callers use Skype name KCOR Radio. More UFO Classified.
UFO Classified
with Erica Lukes on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. After this.
Monday night at 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. Eastern, we take the KCOR Digital Radio Network off the grid and go deep inside the Paranormal Vault. Jump on the elevator and come take the ride down the rabbit hole of reality with BK Mojave and The Watcher as they unlock the vault and dust off some of their classified paranormal case files even the government doesn't know about. The Paranormal Vault, Mondays at 8 p.m. Pacific, 11 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. This is the one show our secret government fears will speak the truth.
Hello? I can't hear you, but you can hear me, right?
Now, hang on, I want to make sure I understand. So a non-citizen can go over to a hospital and walk in and get emergency treatment. That never happens here.
What happens? Jobs are created. Guess what happens? The economy grows. Then you have more people paying taxes. Do they not understand?
I don't want to hear any more about Islam. I don't want to hear one more word about Islam. Take your religion and shove it up your behind. I'm sick of you.
Fatigued by the identical mind-numbing viewpoints up and down the dial?
You fat pig who lies on his back all day, demanding that everybody else subsidize them. What do, jerk? All right.
Well, listen to the master of provocative insight, Dwight Lilly, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network, Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern. Whether it's local or national news, Dwight has his finger on the pulse of the nation.
So now you've got a case where Cliven Bundy, in an interview first broke in the New York Times, his comments are beyond repugnant to me. They are beyond despicable to me. They are beyond ignorant to me.
The Dwight Lilly Show, never restrained and always opinioned. Talk without the fluff.
The world is about to change forever.
Get your weekly dose of truth every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Pacific and 10 p.m. Eastern, only on the KCOR Digital Radio Network.
This is the world-famous KCOR.
That's the only station I listen to.
Friday night, 9 p.m. Pacific. Jump onto the Celestial Highway and travel at the speed of light.
into hyperspace. Hyperspace. Hosted by Solaris Blue Raven. She navigates you through the cosmic tides of mysticism into the world of covert technology, UFOs, mystical sciences, and the world of unforeseen forces.
You get to really sort of enjoy a bizarre ride.
Listen live, Friday night, 9 p.m. Pacific. For Hyperspace, the one show that blows the whistle off our government black ops projects. Hyperspace, hosted by Solaris Blue Raven. Exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. Want to take a ride?
You're listening to UFO Classified with Erica Lukes, where the truth isn't hidden beneath the black lines of a Sharpie.
That's the craziest thing I've ever heard.
To be on with Erica, call 702-425-9230. That's 702-425-9230. Worldwide callers use Skype name KCOR Radio.
Radio contact.
Share your thoughts on the show on Twitter by using hashtag KCOR. Or head over to the live chats at KCORradio.com.
The audience goes nuts!
And now, your host of UFO Classified.
Are you ready?
Erica Lukes.
I am back tonight with probably the most important guest I've had on my show. And I will say that from the bottom of my heart. Barry Greenwood has been an absolute saint to me with regard to my research and has willingly just sent me information about the Brown Mountain Lights, about the Delbert Newhouse case, about the Waldo Harris case, about all of these things. And that has really helped me to prepare not only for my upcoming lecture at UFO Congress, but to try to put a bigger perspective on all of these things, because they're all related, and history is vital to understand, especially with regard to all of this. Barry Greenwood and his tremendous archives can be found online at greenwoodufoarchive.com. And it's important to say that if any of you know people out there that are UFO researchers in your area and you are in fear that their work will be lost forever, please make an attempt to reach out to them. And when you find that information, let Barry Greenwood know or Jan Aldrich know, so they can preserve the work and put it in one place for each of us to be able to access. This is vital. Please share this information. It's important. And Barry, when we left off, we were talking about the Foo Fighters and all of these great cases. You can read Strange Company from Keith Chester to learn more about that. But let's talk now about Phil Klass.
Yes, Phil. I met him a few times. One for a particularly long time when I went to Washington to do research at the archives. I called him up one day because he wasn't all that far away, and I had some communications with him about different cases and all. So I said I was in the area, and can I stop over if you have time? And he said, oh, sure, come on over. So went over to his townhouse, and he answered the door in his pajamas. I said, he's not ready for this, is he? What happened was he had a cold, and he didn't tell me that. So I told him I was sorry. I wish I knew he was sick, or I wouldn't have bothered. And he said, oh, no, come on in. And we sat down in his study and chatted for a while about the subject. And then he said, I'm going to go upstairs and get dressed. And I said, oh, you don't have to go through all that. He wanted to go to his private club and get something to eat. So he and his wife and I went over there, and we chatted about the subject for a good hour or so. But it inevitably came to a question that I think everybody's always had wanted to ask him. And I put it out, and I said, Phil, why is it that you stay involved in the subject? I said, you clearly don't think there's not anything to it. You're very critical of all the stories. They all have flaws according to your research. And why bother? Why waste time on it? And he had two Well, it's sort of a 2.5-word answer. He said, I'm hooked. And that was it. He said, that's it. That's the only explanation for it. I'm hooked on the subject. And that explains it all as to why he wanted to stay involved with it. He liked the subject in spite of his being a critical skeptic of it. He wanted to continue doing the research. He loved the correspondence and exchanges with people. And later on, I sent him an email asking another question, which was on a similar vein, that given his attitude on the subject, you think that the subject should be preserved. In other words, all the files, paperwork, books and literature, everything written about UFOs. Is it a waste of time to keep it all? Or what? What do I do with it? And he said, Barry, I would highly recommend that all UFO literature be preserved for researchers to consult into the distant future, so that they would be able to understand the subject the way it happened as it's happening in current times. And he would not advocate destroying any of it. And I thought to myself, well, I mean, if there was a bigger argument for preservation of the subject, I couldn't imagine a comment any better than that came from class. Because outwardly, he didn't think there was much to it, but inwardly, you have to save it. You have to keep tabs on it. You have to develop the information, use it for research. And that applies now. Don't throw it out. Keep it. Send it somewhere where someone can make use of it. Even if they're seemingly duplicates, common things, common books, common literature. Send it somewhere where others can make use.
Exactly. And that's so vital. And I think, too, just being transparent with information. I think this is vital because there's so many people out there that sometimes feel really isolated, but they want to research and they need to have these places like your archive to go to study and start making the connections and contribute to the field.
Yeah, people should never be afraid to ask simple questions about the subject and things they've heard over the years. Yeah, I mean, you can bring up seemingly unrelated things like Bermuda Triangle and Bigfoot and all of that and how it's connected to UFOs. And, you know, we've gotten that over the years quite a bit, but ask, because that's the only way you're going to learn as to whether there's a connection with things like that or not, or whether the question you're asking is relevant to something. And if it's not, we be polite to them and say, you know, we've been asked that before, and you give a brief comment on it. And if it requires more explanation, you give it to them so that they can be encouraged to be involved in the subject.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, you know, we've had a question tonight about MJ-12.
Yeah,
which I know, I mean, this really talk about some controversy in the field. You lived that, but can you give us like a little teeny, like a nutshell?
Well, yeah, MJ-12 really started in the early 80s with some rumors, some odd documents that had circulated at the time mentioning things like Project Snowbird and MJ-12 existed at one time, and there were allegedly some high-ranking people involved with it. And that churned on for several years at that rate with rumors, but little that was really concrete. And I wrote an article about it in Just Cause, wondering what it was all about. It was at the prompting of a fellow named Lee Graham who sent me some information on it he had acquired from William Moore, who was at the time one of the main knowledgeable people about MJ-12. So I reproduced it. Not documents, but just information about who the MJ-12 members were alleged to be and whether it was a plausible thing. And I left it in the air because we really didn't have much on it. And then a couple of years go by after that, and there were very strong stories coming out about documents that are about to be released in the spring of '87. So I waited, and And some newspaper information got out in connection with Timothy Good releasing his book about Top Secret. And apparently he had some information in that about MJ-12. And because of what Good did, Bill Moore, who had planned to release the information at the same time, Good prematurely released his, so Moore had to rush his information out, and he released an issue of his newsletter that was going to reveal the documents. And I got it in the mail. I looked at it, and I think within 10 minutes of looking at the documents, I realized that this was just a crock. There was just nothing to it. The documents were ridiculous. What most people had seen of the MJ-12 documents, the popular ones, the Eisenhower briefing and a few teletypes and all, those weren't the only things that were part of that release. There were other things released that, if they had been released, would be seen as patently ridiculous. There were several CIA documents that were clearly typed up in an amateurish fashion and said absolutely nonsensical, practically indecipherable things, with the intent of being obtuse and mysterious, but just coming across as nonsensical. And I realized at that point the documents just weren't going to go very far, but I had to spend a lot of time on it to show that. And I spent the summer of '87 filing requests, and Bob Todd got into it too and chased down documents. And we issued a report in September that said that this was not real, that we felt it was a hoax, and the hoax being based upon things that Bill Moore had told us in trying to help do research on the topic. He appeared to be highly motivated for money and little else. He didn't want any help. He wanted to dominate the thing himself, and essentially told us that he was looking for a payday. So from then on, it was just one thing after another about the documents and the circumstances around them that told us this was all manufactured. These weren't genuine government documents, even though there were some government people involved with it. I had felt that they were involved with it on a personal level rather than on an official level. And I think that consumed about 10 years of our time, almost semi-regularly looking into it. So MJ-12 to me is not real.
Okay. I mean, what is your take on the disinfo agents? I mean, what's the agenda there? And do you think that that's really as common as...
I've never met any.
Okay.
I told Larry Fawcett one time that, it's funny. There's all these stories about disinformation people and spooks running around feeding information to ufologists and all. Larry had not experienced that, and I had not experienced that. And both of us were deeply involved in government document research, which should have made the both of us targets of that kind of information feeding. But we received documents, strange-looking documents and all, but I was very dismissive of them all because the problem they had was that there was no provenance to them. One of the key points in writing clear intent and including documents was to make sure that the documents in there had a provenance, where we knew from where those documents came. We had strong links to the agencies that created them. So we had confidence that these were produced within the government. Whereas these other documents would be given to us by other ufologists or mailed mysteriously, and there was no provenance, no cover letters, nothing to explain exactly where they came from or that they were officially cleared for release. There was just nothing there with them. So those would go into the other file, but keep but don't do anything with file, because we didn't want to mix fake material with genuine material and thereby discrediting the genuine material by association.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, we've only got a short time left for the show, but who do you think when you look at this field now, who do you think some of the biggest, I guess not, I hate to use the word con men, but who are the people that are kind of leading this field astray now?
Oh boy, that's asking for a lawsuit.
Okay, well then.
I have opinions, but I don't know if I want to broadcast it.
But then, how would we phrase that?
Well, the way you can assess that kind of information is to do exactly what I did with Clear Intent. Whatever story you're told, determine its provenance. If it's well-grounded, well-sourced, and if it's not, you have a big question mark plastered right on it. And leave it there until you're satisfied that the origin is legitimate and real and based on something factual. That's how I would do it.
Absolutely. And I mean, we had a question early on tonight, and I'm really happy that he is patient, but what books would you suggest people to read? Where would you go? How do you think people should really delve into this?
Part of the problem with that is that a lot of the books are out of print now. I would recommend some of the older books on the subject because they came out of what I would regard as a more purified era where the information wasn't contaminated by modern mores and attitudes. Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Ruppelt. You'll find mistakes in there, things that he did wrong, but as an overall history of Project Blue Book, it's very interesting. Even some of the books by Donald Kehoe. Yeah, he's a strong-heeled believer in the subject, but if you separate his theories from the information that he reported, then the information is fascinating. They're based on official documents or things the Air Force released, and you'll get a good picture of how the thinking about the government's involvement in the subject evolved over the years by reading some of Kehoe's works. He wrote between 1950 and 1974, covering that time frame. So I would recommend that. I would recommend, the Condon Report, in spite of its very negative conclusions about the subject, is a very important historical document. As long as you're able to discern bad information from useful information. The odd thing about the Condon Report was I think fully a third of the case histories they looked into, they didn't explain very well, which was the whole purpose of the report, to get the Air Force released from the obligation of doing UFO investigations. And where the Air Force had something like 5% unknowns or so, the Condon Report percentage of unknowns in their case investigations was something like 6 times higher, which is saying, well, how could they say there's nothing to it?
Exactly.
But that should be read. I would recommend some of the skeptical books for sure. For the other point of view, you have to have a balance. Carl Sagan and Thornton Page did one in 1972 based on 1969 AAAS symposium. It was one of the top science groups, and they allowed UFOs onto the floor for a day. So I would recommend reading that. It has some really, really good information in it. Any of the writings of James McDonald, Alan Hynek. It's just a lot of good, solid information out there that can be read, but you have to be careful. Make sure you're dealing with credible authors.
Right. And that's hard to come by now, but I think if people just use common sense, it's like I purchased Project Identification, Harley Rutledge's study, and that was really expensive, but that was an important book to have, or Greg Long's study on Yakima, again, another important book that you told me about.
Right. Pinpointed works on specific incidents or specific topics. Sometimes it's really good and other times not. But the best thing to do is, if you know someone that's been in the subject a long time, ask them what's good and what isn't. And it can save you a lot of time from assessing bad information is something that's on an equal par with something more well-grounded. You need to talk to people, ask questions. That's why I say don't be afraid to ask questions of long-timers. You might get a cranky one now and then, but others will answer you.
And it's really interesting because I've been so fortunate that I could reach out to you and Fran and a few others that have been very willing to help give me good information, and Dr. Haynes and all of these people that they all of you want me to move forward with all of the information. And I think that's really important. And then every once in a while, I've reached out to one of those cranky people that really doesn't want to share information because they're waiting to sell their next book or whatever they're doing. And that's unfortunate because we're not going to get anywhere unless we share this information and think of a tactical way to move forward. And
you get the cranks, you just take the experience and move along to somewhere else more productive.
Well, exactly. And I'm really happy that I can move away from the cranks, and I've got people like you that I can learn from. And like I said, I'm so excited about this Delbert Newhouse stuff that you have sent me.
The guys that have been in it for a long time, we call ourselves graybeards. I literally have a gray beard myself, but we call ourselves that. And the one thing that I think we really want is for young people to take an interest in it so that they can preserve the subject, make sure it survives rather than drops through the cracks of history. We don't want to see this information disappear. And with some of us, we don't know what to do with the massive information, where to send it, who to give it to. It's hard to donate them to libraries and universities now because they don't want them. They don't want to take the shelf space up with flying saucer stuff.
Well, they're going to regret that decision coming up pretty quick because I think that there are good people out here, that want to carry on and that value your work. And and Jans and everybody. We're going to make
scan. Get your information. If you have something unique, it exists in small amounts or just one, scan it and send it somewhere where it'll survive. More copies, the better. If the original disappears, you have the scan. The scan preserves the data, and that's what's important. You don't care about the paper it's printed on, but you want the information on the paper.
So where can people go to send it to a good place?
Well, contact any of us. Contact me, contact Project 1947, contact the Sign Historical Group, contact guys like Michael Swords, Tom Tulane, who has an oral history project on UFO personalities that's been going on for a long time. He preserves information. Anyone connected with the history investigation of history or the cultural background on the phenomenon, contact them, find out what you can do with your information. We can recommend some place for it to go. You mentioned Greg Long. He's contemplating passing his files along now.
Are you kidding?
He's considering it, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry just to gasp like that, but I just about fell over in my chair. Oh, wow.
Yeah, he sent me an email and asked if I could take care of his files.
Oh my gosh!
Because there is that concern. His everybody's age and health is in the balance, and you want to know that your life's work can go to someone who will give it some meaning.
Absolutely, and you know that I will do anything, and I know that my partner, Jeff Cox, all of us here will do anything that we can to help you preserve history.
A lot of us are online. We have websites. We are available. Just enter the names in search engines if you don't have a web address, and the search engine should direct you to where you can find us.
That's great, and I'll keep posting that. And I can't thank you enough because you have been so very kind to me, and you are, in my opinion, a hero. Absolutely. There's no other way to say it. You're a hero. And not only for ufology, for this research, but I truly feel for mankind because this is that important of an issue. And it will be remembered.
It's part of the overall controversy on life in space, life in the universe. Does it exist or not? UFO topic is an integral, inescapable part of that. Regardless of what you think of the topic itself, it'll always be connected to that controversy. And that's important to preserve.
Absolutely. And I definitely think, I mean, there is something here. There's an intelligence, whether it's extraterrestrial, interdimensional, whatever it is. It's here, and it's important to study. So Barry Greenwood, thank you so much. I'm Erica Lukes. This is UFO Classified. The archive will be up later tonight because you're going to listen to this again. Have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you next Friday.
Listen very carefully.
This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
This is UFO Classified, live every Friday night, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. The truth is out there, just waiting to be discovered.
And now, if you will, accompany me on a journey to the future.
For more information on the host of UFO Classified, Erica Lukes, upcoming guests, as well as links to the past shows,
visit her website at UFOclassified.com.
UFO Classified.
UFO Classified. UFO Classified.
This is KCOR Las Vegas, home of the Digital Radio Network, broadcast